So thanks again for joining us for today's webinar, Fall Herbicide Application for Invasive Plants. There are many considerations when timing herbicide treatments for the control of invasive plant species, including the target weed species, the stage of growth, other plants on site, and more. Today, ISCBC's Dave Ralph will explore the considerations for timing of fall herbicide applications. I am pleased to give a warm welcome and introduction to Dave, Operations and Extension Manager. Dave has been with ISCBC since 2015. He has worked in all aspects of invasive plant management and extension for over 40 years with the BC Ministry of Agriculture, the Western Indian Agriculture Corporation, and the BC Ministry of Forests, Lands, and Natural Resource Operations. Dave now manages ISCBC's Technical Invasive Plant Extension, the Gravel Pit Invasive Plant Management Program, and Stronger BC operations. At this point, I will pass the mic over to you, Dave. I hope you all enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Melanie. Everybody can see that. Give me a thumbs up, Melanie, if that's coming through for you.
We can see it great, Dave. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much, everybody. And thanks to the council for asking me to do this presentation today. I think it's quite timely because we've got some nice fall weather coming on. We get some warm temperatures and we are getting the precipitation across the province. We had a lot of rain here in Kamloops last night and things are starting to get moist again. So with those two things, environmental factors, we start seeing a lot of regrowth in the invasive species that we're working with. I see that my screen's popped off there, Melanie.
Yeah, I'm just going to get you to click on share screen and then select only the PowerPoint, please, Dave.
Right, okay. Good.
That's perfect, thank you. Okay,
thanks very much. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of regrowth from the perennial plants and we're seeing a lot of germination of seed in the fall. So over the decades, I was sort of raised my eyebrow when Melanie was saying it's been over 40 years, but we've seen a lot of really excellent results in weed management with fall treatment of our sites. Ideally, of course, we like to get out early in the season when the seedlings are germinating, when the plants are starting to growth and there's really active growth for the beginning of the seasons. But it's not the only time of the year that we can see really good weed control. A sec here. So there's when you're using your herbicide and you're choosing it, there's a lot of factors that depend on what herbicide you're going to be using. What's your active ingredient? What kind of characteristics that the herbicide has, so that you can match that with what's your target weed species? Are they annuals? Are they winter annuals, biennials, or perennials? What are the stages of growth of your target weed species? Crops or non-target plants on the site. Are there any of those? Is this just a fallow site or is it just got grasses? Is it going to be put into a crop in subsequent years? This is what you've got to consider when you're doing treatment and you're using a residual herbicide. What are the plans for that particular site? Is it staying as perennial grasses, or is there going to be some legumes or shrubs being put in there? Your soil texture and the depth of that soil is a factor. You want to be looking at your herbicide labels to see if there's any precautions or information with regards to soil texture. When you're choosing your herbicide, you definitely want to be cognizant of where your water sources and riparian areas are. You've got to be sure that you do your pesticide-free zones appropriately, which, as a reminder, is 1 meter above high water mark for glyphosate products. And for all other products, it's 10 meters above high water mark. And of course, when you are measuring out your pesticide-free zones, you've got to be cognizant of your ground slope. So if you are measuring out a 10-meter pesticide-free zone on a level ground, the chances of that herbicide moving into that pesticide-free zone laterally on a level ground is very low. But as your slope increases, you will be wanting to consider maybe increasing that distance from the high water mark to maybe 11 or 12 meters. Leaching occurs naturally. It is also accelerated when there's water or rain incidents after application. Check your I'm sorry about that, folks. Low Tech Dave here. When you want to consider what herbicides you're going to be using, are you going to be using contact herbicides that are really only destroying the plant tissue in the leaves? That's what the foliar treatments do, like paraquat or diquat. They're typically not used for perennials because if it's just chemically destroying the plant tissue and the above ground parts, it's going to regrow. So it's just a suppression or stop growth that's not going to last at all. Translocated herbicides, you want to be using either selective herbicides like 2,4-D, picloram, milestone. Typically the non-selective herbicides like paraquat and diquat, but for translocating, we use glyphosate as the product that we typically use. Glyphosate, if you're working as a weed specialist, you'll know that it's not a really preferred herbicide that we use for invasive plants because it is non-selective and it's taking out all of the non-target plants on a site, unlike the selective products are only taking out the broadleafs and leaving the grasses. So residuality of the herbicide, you want to be considering that, as I mentioned, non-residual for glyphosate. Short-term residual products include 2,4-D, which can last up to about 6 weeks to maybe a little longer. It depends on your soil type. Dicamba, maybe up to 8 to 12 months. If it's in a drought situation, we've seen dicamba residuality last beyond the 1 year period and maybe up to about 18 months. Aminopyrrolid and sulfuron methyl, we're looking at about 2 years to 3 years, depending on the soil type, of course. And also we're looking at the long-term residuality of picloram. Picloram's still a product that we use a lot. It has a residuality of anywhere from 3 to 7 years, depending on the soil types, as well as depending on the rates that you're going on with picloram. Obviously, the higher the rate, the longer residuality. With all of these residual herbicides, we want to also caution everybody that they not to be using them on soils that are going to be transient. If those soils that you're applying these residual products to have the chance of being moved or removed and put in another location, then we certainly want to avoid applying to those soils. Also, what's your subsequent cropping going to be? Is there going to be a development or is there going to be other crops put in? So those are things that we looked at with residual products. And then soil applied is typically a pre-plant incorporated process. And most often we see that being carried out in intensive cropping situations in agricultural crop production. Spray equipment calibration and having your equipment in really good condition is a real key to good herbicide efficacy. You want to make sure you calibrate your equipment properly. We suggest at least 3 times to get the average. You want to do it frequently. Nozzles wear. Applicators may change, equipment may change. If it's on a vehicle, if it's using a backpack, you want to be having the same person use that backpack all the time so that you know what the delivery rate is. Delivery rate is real critical for the correct application rates. If you don't know what your delivery rate is on your sprayer, you have no idea how much herbicide to put in it. And with products like Milestone that have very low application rates, 1/2 liter per hectare, it's not only the the opportunity, if you don't know the calibration, to get too low a rate or too high a rate, you may be using way more herbicide than's required. And at $1,800 for 10 liters of Milestone, you certainly want to make sure you're putting on the exact rate that's required. Always check your pressures, make sure they're constant. That's always something that will have your calibration deviate. Your nozzles and your hoses are all in good condition. You don't want them breaking during spraying operations. You're going to be having a spill of some sort. It's also a real safety issue. Incorrect application rates, always want to read your label so that you know exactly what application rate you should be using on specific weeds or within specific crops. Too low of application rate will give you very poor efficacy. It will also court resistance. One of the reasons that we see weed resistance occur is when rates are too low, and there's always that 1 or 2 plants that's going to survive that application rate, and they will go to seed, and there will be a genetic modification to that plant. And the subsequent year, the seeds that are ripened off of that plant will have a better opportunity to be resistant to the herbicide if it's being used again. Hence, you should always read your label as far as how to avoid herbicide resistance. And that's typically using different modes of action in herbicides over a period of a couple, 3 years, maybe 3 years with one product, and then change it up the mode of action in the 4th year. Like low rates, high rates can also cause poor metabolic process and not kill that plant properly. Often what we find that the plants will go into an almost shock mode, and they will be stressed and they don't absorb the herbicide properly, and it's not translocated properly. Again, this is courting resistance. So be cognizant of your application rates. Crop weed canopy, water volumes. You will find that low volumes can be used off of a label. When there's no canopy or less canopy in your area that you're doing treatment. Typically, we see less canopy in the fall time as products mature or herb plants mature or weed species, and we see the foliage dying off. High water volumes, they typically have a closed canopy, or we're using higher volumes on a closed canopy to increase penetration. This is typically used more, the higher volumes, a lot in the spring. In the summer, when the plants are really in rapid growth and there's lots of foliage and so forth. With residual products, you will want some soil application, so hence the higher water volumes to penetrate that canopy. Too little coverage or will not penetrate them, and you don't want to be putting on more than you need. You shouldn't be applying herbicide to runoff. Especially if you're using a herbicide that's you've got high rates and or is an expensive one. There's no advantage to efficacy with applying it to foliage that's running off. Your plant type and your growth stages. You want to pick your herbicide and determine what the efficacy will be on annuals versus perennials. there's typically no reason to be using herbicides on both. You might want to use a herbicide that has a low residuality or none on an annual. You would just have to kill that plant off before seed set. If you are doing applying to annuals at a site that maybe have a lot of seed productivity, they've matured, they've set seed, you might want to consider using a residual herbicide to control the subsequent germinates from that annual. For perennials, definitely we're going to be looking at using herbicides that have residuality. And of course, depending on sites, we might want to be using glyphosate if we're within that 10-meter pesticide-free zone or something. We really don't have much of a choice when it comes to that. Application timing. This is a lot of information that you glean off of the label. You want to be looking at the label. It's going to make a recommendation to you as to what stage of growth herbicide may be applied at. For example, with 2,4-D in certain weed species, the requirement is that their weed species are sprayed in the seedling stage, and they might even have a leaf stage that they recommend for best results for control. Reseeding timing, you want to be considering if you're going to be going in and reseeding the area. Seedling, bolting, or active growing mature, it'll be decided for you on the label as to what stage of growth. With residual herbicides, especially the ones that have longer residuality, we have a little bit of a wider window as far as our treatment times go because of that residuality in the soil that will be, the herbicide actives will be picked up by root or either and resided in the soil for a period of time so that subsequent germinates are controlled as well. August is a typical time that we're not going to have a lot of regrowth. We don't see a lot of activity on the target plants that we're going for. They've just set seed or are producing seed, and maybe even into early September. So effectiveness immediately might be not evident when we're applying herbicides at that time. But with residual herbicides, we'll see the effectiveness as the plants start to regrow in the fall. Definitely not using glyphosate in August would be a good choice. You're only killing what it's contacting that's green, and that's not much of that available in the period of August when it's very hot and the plant's sort of in a mode where there's not much activity or growth carrying on. Spring versus fall, we've sort of discussed that. We'd prefer to do it in the spring, so we're not letting plants go to seed that year, but fall is still a really excellent time to be controlling weed species. Crop and non-target plants and what stage they're at in the areas that you're doing your herbicide treatment. You'll want to be looking again at the labels for that. Weather and climatic influences. A lot of questions, I get a lot on when can I treat, how long after does a rain have to occur where it's going to really affect my efficacy. So we don't want to apply prior to any rain events. We know that they're imminent, and of course not during any rain events. Typically, most herbicide products, we're looking at 4 to 6 hours after treatment. Some of the glyphosate products have built-in surfactant that reduce the post treatment time to receive precipitation, but down to an hour or two. You can certainly consider using a surfactant as well in a herbicide, but definitely check the label to make sure that if that herbicide can be used with a surfactant, ensure that the surfactant that you're using is the correct kind and recommended. Of course, temperature, we are bound by temperature for maximum be to the point when we have to stop spraying. I believe that's 27, 28 degrees Celsius. And typically we find during the hot periods, the mornings or the evenings are good time for that. One of the things you should be keeping in mind, though, if you are getting to doing morning spraying or evening spraying, you're using a residual herbicide, humidities are high, that herbicide can linger in the air, and it actually can move laterally for quite a distance. High humidities, zero winds, and are not a good consideration for herbicide treatments. Typically 1 to 2 kilometers an hour of wind is really ideal. It helps move that herbicide droplets to the ground quite quickly and doesn't allow them to linger in the atmosphere. Soil conditions, pH. The pH of your soil will definitely affect certain herbicides, as well as the pH of water when you're applying herbicides too. Certain lower or higher pHs can cause some of the herbicides, specifically glyphosate, to become ineffective or reduce effectiveness for sure. Organic matter, you're going to have probably a less residual of herbicides when you are applying to organic matters, organic soils. There's lots of microbes in those soils that are quickly breaking down and making the active molecules of the herbicide unavailable to surrounding growth. And of course, texture for sure. Too coarse may reduce your carryover and residuality in the spring. Also, you want to be cognizant of the coarseness of your soils when you're applying a residual herbicide, just so that you're not in the, it's not going to enter any shallow aquifers or just have the ability to leach long distances. Spray retention, this is all about your foliage, and you want to be cognizant of your leaf characteristics. Is there a waxy cutin on the leaf surfaces? Burdoc's a good example of that. Makes it a little bit more difficult for the herbicide to penetrate into that leaf surface and into the plant itself. The leaf shape, the surface, are there pubescent hairs on the leaves and stems? This is one of the characteristics of blueweed that make it a little bit more of a difficult weed species to control with herbicides, is that the herbicide droplets sort of suspend themselves on the tops of the hairs of the leaves and also of the, some of the stem parts, and it makes it less effective for the plant to absorb those herbicide mixtures and the spray. So you might want to consider using a surfactant on plants like that. I know that when we're spraying Japanese knotweed and the knotweed complex, we're always looking at getting a herbicide applied to the underside of the leaves on large plants like that, and even smaller ones. The stomata on the underside of the leaves is usually more active than the ones on the top of the leaf. So the absorption into the plant through that leaf stomata is increased when we're able to get some herbicide treatment on the underside of those leaves. Herbicide metabolism, selectivity due to plant physiology. There's certain invasive plant species we deal with out there on a regular basis, like mustards, Horia alyssum, garlic mustard. They're not affected by most of the auxin herbicides we're using, like picloram, like aminopyrrolid. They don't have any effect on these mustard species. So we do use herbicides, some of these herbicides in combination with 2,4-D, and we can get some efficacy on the plant, but typically we're not usually using those together. There is, we get zero effect from aminopyrrolid alone, yet we get very excellent on mustards, yet we get very excellent control with products like Clearview, which are metsulfuron methyl plus aminopyrrolid. So there is some sort of synergy happening in the chemistry of those herbicides, so we see that increased efficacy with some of those active ingredient combinations. Typically, these plants are able to detoxify the herbicide, and so that's why they're not having any effect on the plants themselves. Winter annuals, mustards, shepherd's purse, henbit, chickweed. Consider those plants for good fall application. Those species and other winter annuals have a big flush of rosette plants in the fall. And then when spring comes, the rosettes are just continue and start up regrowth again. And as a result, they're usually some of the first plants that are maturing and setting seed, as is typically seen in a lot of alfalfa plantings. A lot of new alfalfa seedings, we see mustard and shepherd's purse being the first plants up, and they're already in flower, and the alfalfa is still in the act of growing. Typically in alfalfa, we don't have any herbicides that are real effective. We do a lot of annual weed control on alfalfa using early harvesting. You might lose a little yield, but you'll stop those annuals from going to seed and setting seedlings up, and then have the new seeding of the forage alfalfa or grass has an opportunity to fill in before the next year. Biennials, we see a lot of fall rosettes and seedlings, and we also see a lot of basal foliage growth with a lot of our biennials and our perennials as well. The knapweeds are a good example. Dalmatian toadflax, I'll show you some slides and look down a little further into this presentation and show you what I mean by that. Perennials, a lot of our perennials have creeping roots, the rhizomes. There's a lot of active root growth in the fall. There's a lot of increased translocation of energy after that light frost. Typically what we're seeing is, a lot of the philosophy behind fall herbicide application is that we have that active growth in the fall, as I mentioned. The plants are busy developing foliage from the root crown. There's a lot of seedling germination, and a lot of the perennials that have creeping roots or rhizomes are busy putting a lot of energy into developing new foliage with that weather change. But once we get that light frost, it's that -2, 3 degrees. The frost typically will kill off our, cucumbers, our tomatoes, and so forth. But our hardier plants that are in the garden, or our hardier garden, horticulture plants, garden vegetable plants, they resist that frost. And also most of our invasive species resist that frost that are biennials or perennials. But it's the trigger that tells those plants that winter is coming, and whether it be a rhizomatous plant or even a taprooted plant, the plant starts reversing its energy flow down into the roots to store up that energy for the winter to come. So by applying herbicides during that particular time of the year and stage of growth and that timing, we see a excellent translocation of the herbicides into the roots. Not only just the taprooted plants, but it's especially effective on the rhizomatous plants like Canada thistle, Dalmatian toadflax, somewhat on leafy spurge, although research shows that leafy spurge isn't maybe the best plant to do a fall application. But nevertheless, there is that rapid movement of energy and the herbicide itself as well. So those fall warm temperatures and increased moisture cause the germination of a lot of seedlings too. And that's a really great time to get those seedlings. They won't be there on the ground to start up and start competing with our desirable vegetation the following spring. So herbicidal effects occur primarily from the uptake by the plant's foliage and the translocation through the plant. However, secondary herbicidal action may occur from soil uptake. you know, I don't want to downplay the fact that there is soil uptake by herbicides, by plants of the herbicides there. Typically, what you'll find is the longer a herbicide is residing in the soil, it starts moving down in the soil profile with the advent of moisture and rains. So a seedling plant roots may not come into the soil regime of where the herbicides residing if it's been in the soil for a year or two, and it might take a bit for those plants to see the effect of taking on that herbicide. So we'll go through some of the herbicides here that we're typically using for invasive plant management. Milestone aminopyralid, did a lot of work with Dow Agro when that product was being researched and prior to registration. It's a great herbicide. It's got a couple of years worth of residuality, and then the product in the soil tends to drop off quite rapidly, and it allows for some follow-up seed, cropping changes if that's the case. Once per annual growing season, be cognizant of these labels, that some of them only allow one application to a site per season. Some of them, like a Milestone, allows for 2 applications per season. So the maximum rate per hectare of product is 0.5, but as you'll see on the Milestone label, there's some different rates for different weed species. If you are strictly doing a knapweed site, it's a monoculture of knapweed, or that's the only weed species that's there, 0.25 will be very effective. If you're doing a treatment on a site that has a variety of weed species on it, typically we're saying let's use the maximum rate so that we're going to get effective control on all of the species that are at that site. Of course, we like to apply the product when when the weed species are smaller and actively growing. It's the product selective on broadleaf weeds and broadleaf invasives. One of the things about Milestone, its label reads is it allows us to go in and apply as a pre-emergent control for weeds. So one of the few labels that says that. It's typically most of the other labels like Clearview, they're applied post weed growth. So the weeds have to be growing in order to go in and apply, not that pre-emergence. So it's not to say that we're going to go out and spray an area that we don't know whether there's any weeds going to be there, but we're definitely given the advantage to go out and do some pre-emergence weed control on sites that are historically weed sites, that we know what species are there, and we can sort of get a little bit of a head start on that. However, it's always nice to see some weed growth emerging so that you know where your activity, where your spraying should take place. So that being said, it's sort of an opportunity for us, but do that with a little caution. Clearview, metsulfuron methyl and aminopyralid. So metsulfuron methyl is an active ingredient that's typically found in Escort herbicide or Ally herbicide. Escort for croplands, non-croplands, pastures, and areas, and Ally is an in-crop metsulfuron methyl product. So we're looking at 230 grams or 0.23 liters of active product per hectare. It's one application per growing season. It's for all of the areas that we're typically doing most of our invasive plant management. We don't want to be, if you're going to be doing it, you don't want to be doing it in any crop areas. Be cognizant of any crops that are adjacent to the sites you're treating so that you don't get any drift from any spray application, and that you don't get any leaching laterally from the soils that you're applying to the herbicide, to the non-target soils like that crop. Grazon, good product. It's got a couple of different formulations out right now. The Grazon, the older product, is a 65 grams per liter. with 240 of 2,4-D. And then the Grazon XC is a little bit more, almost 10% picloram and about 36% 2,4-D. So we've got to be real cognizant of our residual herbicides, especially ones with picloram in them. And typically they're going to control trees as well. So we want to make sure that when we are doing any herbicide treatment for invasive plants around any trees, we want to make sure that we've got that buffer around the tree itself. Typically, we're looking at about 1.5 times the height of the trees. One of the things we got to watch for is conifers that are on very shallow soils. Those roots can tend to extend way beyond the trees drip line, and so residual herbicides can have a big effect on trees and conifers, and also on broadleaf plants and trees. Leafy spurge and toadflax, with Grazon, we'd be looking at using a surfactant as well. Toadflax typically, just because it's got that rubber cuticle on the leaves that are a little bit more difficult for herbicides to penetrate. Tordon 22K, it's being used less and less. Over the years, we've seen picloram get into the compost system, especially down in the States, but still up here in the and it's still being used down the States, although less and less. We still find it as a good product. We like to use it on areas that are open grasslands, areas that we can't get back to necessarily every year to revisit or do those maintenance or follow-up treatments. And so we will be considering picloram. We've got that long residuality. It really helps stretch the resources as far as being able to control some of these persistent weed sites, even if we're not able to get back during the every season. Look at the herbicide label for picloram. It's got a fairly limited list of weed species on it, but we've done a lot of work, and all of the recommendations that are out there on the FLNRO herbicides and herbicide for specific species, there's a lot expanded label. A lot of these labels say will control weeds such as, and in that case, we have a little bit more of an opportunity to expand the target species that we may use a herbicide for. Lawntrel, good product. It's got a lot of different formulations. Lawntrel is a really good product if we're using it to control invasive species around conifers, because it is registered for Christmas tree plantations. And so it does not have the effect on some of the areas where we're spraying up right next to conifers and so forth. We can get right underneath the drip line. Glyphosate, as I mentioned, is if a frost occurs, it's a good time to be considering application if you're doing a lot of any use with glyphosate. You want to make sure it's any of the weed species are not recovering from your treatments. Glyphosate is a really good product on quackgrass in the fall. As I mentioned, there's not a lot of use for it in invasive plant management unless we're doing it in pesticide-free zones, or where maybe it's a specific use for that area. I just wanted to take the opportunity to show you here on this one particular picture of the leaf and the stem of quackgrass. It's the only grass species out there where the auricles clasp around and meet each other on the stem. So it's a good little quick ID opportunity for identifying quackgrass versus other grass species. As I mentioned, glyphosate works really well on the Canada thistle and toadflax because of their creeping roots, and it translocates very well into the root and the rhizome. You want to be using higher rates on toadflax than you would necessarily on Canada thistle. Again, read that label and look at the rates. And interestingly, the fall application of herbicides sort of started gaining steam when the farmers on the prairies were doing their fall knockdown using glyphosate to knock down some of their cereal crops to make it easier for harvesting, less debris to put through the combine. And they started seeing some really excellent weed control on Canada thistle and toadflax from the fall applications, and of those burn down products with burn down use of glyphosate. And so a lot of research got done with a lot of different agencies, and we started identifying that fall application had some really good opportunities for us. I'll move along here a little bit. This is getting into more cropping situations, but glyphosate as well. Good fall application to renovate alfalfa stands or grass stands. We're getting into some products like Horiolism, when we're going to be looking at some regrowth here. So, you know, Horiolism's an annual, biennial, or perennial, depending. When heavy frosts prior to application can reduce control, but apply after the but don't apply after the first damaging frost. This is all this whole light frost prior to the killing frosts. So this is the window we're looking at when we're doing our last bit of fall application, is that that light frost that triggers the plant into translocation downward into the roots event of the plant. And so this is especially pertinent to plants that have a rhizome or a creeping root too. So you'll see here, this is you know, a good time to be doing Horiolism a little earlier in the season. But when we look at the rosettes, these are some fall rosettes. These on the picture on the left is some regrowth from the basal leaves. It's continuing to grow. We see Horiolism growing continually throughout the year. So early spring, all through the year into the fall is a good time for Horiolism, but just showing you some of the regrowth in the fall. Timing is critical for Horicress. It's another creeping rooted mustard species, so we got to be careful to pick the herbicide that's going to be effective on it. We want to ensure that the seedlings and the new shoots have enough regrowth to accept adequate amounts of herbicide to kill a plant, and not just to accept it or suppress it. So on some of these plants, you definitely want to not just be doing, you know, on regrowth from the parent plant, from the plant that's just matured that year, and we're starting to get its perennial growth into the subsequent years. You want to make sure that you do have enough foliage for that plant to accept enough herbicide, because at that stage, after it's into the second or third year of growth with a perennial weed species, it's developed quite a good rooting system. So there's got to be enough herbicide that's going to translocate down. And these are typical fall plants with Horiolism, Horicress rather, and a lot of good growth there on the rosettes in the fall, and some good regrowth on these plants after they've hardened off and they're regrowing in the fall. Canada thistle, just a great historic picture there of shows you the extent of the creeping rhizomes from a Canada thistle infestation that's been there a few years. And so the good example of how you've got to have enough foliage and top growth structures on the plant, your weed species, in order to get enough herbicide down into the very bottom of those roots. The surfactants increase absorption. They allow them to gather on the leaf, and then they, as a result of that, absorption into the plant is increased as well. So that's one of the main benefits of surfactants. It also allows that herbicide product to reside on the leaves a little longer to give that plant time as well. So these are, you know, it's typical Canada thistle infestation. This is maybe not so much some fall growth, but Canada Thistle using a lot of the different products, Milestone. Grazon works very effective on Canada Thistle. Good application efficacy throughout the entire year. With knapweed, we see a lot of rosette growth in the fall. The moisture and the warmth give that seed the situation in which to germinate and grow. And then we also see a lot of basal root crown regrowth from knapweed plants that have matured off. Being a perennial plant, they're just getting the opportunity to get some regrowth started for the subsequent year. So this is a good time to be spraying knapweed. Just make sure that if you're in old stands, that you're going to get enough penetration to get down to the ground to get those basal leaves, and to also put some herbicide on the soil. For areas that are just got a lot of rosettes and flush of those, your penetration isn't so critical. There's a lot more open canopy for you. Dalmatian toadflax repeat treatments are required to control weeds that are regenerating from seeds or underground parts. All of our weed species require follow-up or maintenance treatments, either because they have seed that survive and are in the soil. Example, knapweed, 14 years of burial, we were getting 25% germination of the seed. So the seeds were still staying viable for large amounts of time. Also with rhizomatous plants like toadflax, they require a number of different follow-up treatments, and because of the persistence and extensive rooting system. So there's still lots of regrowth in the fall here, and we see lots of shoots coming up as well if the weather and the temperatures and the moisture are cooperating and staying nice for us. So again, a surfactant on Dalmatian toadflax is not a bad idea. Just quickly here, I've got about 10 minutes left. I want to give you an opportunity for some questions, but this is something I want to bring up. When we are spraying under a pest management plan, which a lot of us are working under, the plan allows us to spray 1.5 meters radius from an individual plant. So based on this pattern and diagram here, I've placed all of these little zeros, or these O's, as individual plants. So if we were allowed to spray one plant 1.5 meters radius from it, and the next plant 1.5 meters radius, we would have an opportunity to get all of the soil applied with the residual herbicide for subsequent germinants. If you weren't spraying that 1.5 meters, you've got all of these gaps in between. And then we come back later in the year, or we come back the next season, and we see a lot of germination of seedlings and plants in these areas around the plants and areas that we spray. My point here is that you could actually broadcast spray all of these plants and this entire area by staying within the requirements of the pest management plan, and you would not see any seeds that germinated afterwards. After application, they would come in contact with the herbicide. So you wouldn't have these missed areas. You'd come back the next year, you'd be spraying again, I think this is a much more effective way to control a site. You get longer residual control on a larger area, and I think we are reducing the herbicide load on the environment by doing it approaching a site that fits this type of scenario. So my point is, keep in mind, do utilize the 1.5 meters around. Knapweed can throw seeds 3 to 4 feet away. There's a lot of weed seeds that can pop, they don't just fall to the ground below the plant. They are actually have the ability, through help from people through wildlife or weather or wind to throw seeds a fair distance from the plant. So with that in mind, I'll end with, like most other weed management methods, herbicides offer short-term solutions, not the cure. Herbicide use does not address the reasons for the weed problems, and spraying herbicide may merely treat the symptom. So with that, thanks very much for your attention, and I'll open it up for questions. Melanie?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dave, for this great presentation and for your energy and enthusiasm on this topic.
You know,
So,
sometimes I'm in these presentations, I think to myself, have I been talking for the last 30 minutes to myself? Is everybody still here? So,
oh, you still got plenty of people here, Dave. Yeah,
Good.
no, it's crazy how quickly time passes, and we have a lot of questions to actually get
Sure.
through. So I'll start with the first and top voted question and work my way down as time allows. If anyone does have questions, now is the time to type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Remember, not the chat box. And please check the list of questions. And if you see your preferred question already in the Q&A box, click the thumbs up button to upvote the question. And as mentioned, if there's not enough time to address all the questions, there will be an opportunity to pass your question along to Dave. All right, so looking at the top question from Caroline, why the difference between glyphosate high water at 1 meter and all others at 10 meters?
It's a regulation that's in the Invasive Integrated Pest Management Act and Regulations. Yeah, that's been in place in that regulation for a lot of decades. Yeah, I would sort of agree with Carol in questioning that. I'm thinking that we could change that a little bit, but as it stands, that's just a regulation we have to abide by.
All right, thank you, Dave. All right, and the next question I see here is by Dawn. Do you have any comments on fall control of Russian olive and tree of heaven, cutting the trees down at ground level and then painting the stump with Roundup?
I think that's actually glyphosate label technique and recommendation. So yeah, I know that you get some good results from cut stump application of herbicides like maybe Garlon or Roundup. I'd have to look at the label. I'm not sure whether Russian olive is on the Roundup label or the Garlon label, which is triclopyr. But often, as I mentioned in the presentation, herbicide labels will have wording, and the glyphosate label below is a partial list of plants and weeds controlled using glyphosate. So we can have an opportunity to go beyond maybe and treat species that aren't listed on the label. But we want to know whether there's efficacy there. So we'll often do some research into other sources to see if those products were getting positive results.
Excellent.
Does
Thanks.
that answer the question?
I believe so.
If it doesn't, if it doesn't, then they can always phone me and discuss it further.
Absolutely, for sure. All right, thank you, Dave. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. The next one is Roundup glyphosate, and are there other product names for glyphosate, and is it regulated in certain conditions?
A glyphosate is the active ingredient, and Roundup is a product name, trade name. Some of the other trade names are Vantage. I'm just trying to think of some other ones. There's a lot of generic glyphosate glyphosate products out there. Roundup just happened to be the first trade name that was given that the manufacturer gave the glyphosate product. So it's sort of stuck. It's almost become like Kleenex is for Kleenex and Lysol is for Lysol. It's the trade name's almost to the generic name. What was the second part of that question? I'm sorry.
Are there other products named? Oh, I guess you answered that one already. The last part is it regulated in certain conditions?
It's regulated for use in certain crops and situations. or for vegetation management in certain types of situations, like maybe right of way or industrial. It's registered for a lot use in lots of crops. So I think that's probably what their meaning is, rather than conditions. Conditions under which you wouldn't use glyphosate might be imminent rain, rain during rain, maybe drought conditions, stuff like that.
All right, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time to answer the rest of the questions, but rest assured we will be forwarding these questions to Dave and he will answer them. Okay. So on behalf of the Invasive Species Council of BC and all those that are listening, thank you so much again, Dave, for sharing your expertise with us today. We will be emailing all attendees a link to a short survey, and please take a moment to complete it and provide your feedback and ideas for future webinars. We invite you to join us at the 2021 Invasive Species Research Conference, taking place virtually from October 6th to 7th. See the link in the chat window for more information. And if you enjoyed this webinar, please consider supporting ISCBC's work by joining us as a member. Members are offered discounts on paid events and training courses, among other benefits. Visit bcinvasives.ca/join to learn more. All right, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you again, Dave. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.